There and welcome everyone to the webinar. So hello everyone and thank you for joining us, and we have an amazing webinar planned for you today. So my name is Shannon Smedella. I will be your host for today, and as you know, we are going to be speaking with our very special guest, Dr. Gabor Maté. But before we start, I just want to mention that the views expressed here are solely those of the presenters in their private capacity, do not in any way represent the views of Clearmind Medicine. Furthermore, the views and opinions expressed by the speakers are not an endorsement or medical counsel or advice on the prescription of or taking of psychedelics, not regulated by the authorities. As you will hear from Clearmind CEO Dr. Adi Zulafshani shortly here, MEAI has not yet been approved by the FDA or Health Canada. Clearmind is also a new psychedelic company, and it's currently trading on the Canadian Stock Exchange, Frankfurt Stock Exchange, OTC markets in the US, and the details are in the chat. So again, welcome everyone to this very special event that we have today. As you know, we have our very special guest, Gabor Maté, joining us to talk about alcohol use disorder, addiction, and trauma. I will formally introduce Dr. Maté shortly here, but I wanted to quickly highlight that Gabor is an internationally renowned speaker. He's highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. So this event is put on by Clearmind Medicine, and if you haven't heard about Clearmind yet, it's a relatively young psychedelic company. I will invite Clearmind CEO to say a few words in a minute here. Just a few quick housekeeping items. As I mentioned, we'll start with a few words from Clearmind CEO. We'll also have our VP of Business Development, Mark Hayden, say a few words as well. And then, of course, we're going to bring on our guest, Dr. Gabor Maté. After that, we are going to open up the line to some live questions. So if you have any questions for Gabor Maté, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end of the conversation here today. And then at the end, we'll have a survey. We're going to be drawing for one of Gabor's books. So everyone who fills out the survey will be put in a draw for that. And if you forget, I'll remind you at the end of the webinar. So before we bring on our speakers today, some really quick information about the issue at hand. As you know, the title of our webinar today is Psychedelics for Alcoholism. So alcohol use disorder, addiction, and trauma in general affect a large majority of our society. It's not, if it doesn't affect someone directly, they most likely know someone who is affected. And knowing that there could be an effective, widespread solution that could make a profound impact on those suffering is not only remarkable, but it's uplifting. So with alcohol use disorder and binge drinking, alcohol use disorder is characterized by a difficulty to stop or control alcohol use despite adverse social, occupational, or even health consequences. According to the CDC, binge drinking typically happens when men consume 5 or more drinks or women consume 4 or more drinks in about 2 hours. And 37 million US adults, so basically 1 in 6, binge drink once a week in the US. Alcohol consumption contributes to 3 million deaths each year globally, in addition to disabilities and poor health of millions of people because of the use of alcohol. So before we bring on Gabor, I would like to quickly introduce you to the Clearmind CEO and VP of Business Development. We'll start out with our VP of Business Development, Mark Hayden. Mark was the executive director of MAPS Canada for 10 years. He's an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia of Public and Population Health, and he has published on the issue of drug control policy and psychedelics and worked for the Addiction Services for 28 years. Mark is currently the Director of Clinical Research for Psygen and is also VP of Business Development for Clearmind. So without any further ado, welcome, Mark.
Why, thank you, Shannon. It's a pleasure to be here. So we're talking about alcoholism. We're talking about alcohol use disorder. So let me just reflect on what is available today, which is one can get counseling, absolutely. And the bottom line is some people don't want to do that. You can go to AA if you're interested in hardcore abstinence. That works for some people, but not for others. There are a few medications out there, acompisate and naltrexone, for example, will kind of numb the pleasure of alcohol, and antabuse will make you violently ill if you combine it with alcohol. So what we're talking about here is a completely new molecule. It's a molecule that is a new invention for the treatment of alcoholism. It's interesting to explore what it's like to consume MEAI, 5-methoxy-2-aminoindane. If you take one dose, it feels like you had one beer. If you take a second dose, it feels like you've had 2 beers. If you take a third dose, it feels like you've had a very, very low dose of MDMA, about 30 milligrams. So it's warm and fuzzy and, emotional and comfortable, and you feel connected to people. If you take a 4th dose, the experience changes, quite frankly, very abruptly. The best analogy that I've ever had for the experience is you've just finished eating 2 pieces of chocolate-covered, goopy, messy cheesecake, and somebody puts a 3rd piece of cheesecake in front of you and hands you a fork. You can't imagine touching the cheesecake. You can't even, in the wildest fantasy, you're done. You are so absolutely completely done with cheesecake. It's like satiation, complete satiation. So why can't you eat the cheesecake? You're not so stimulated, you're hanging off the ceiling. You're not so sedated, you're crawling around on the floor, unable to walk. You're just satiated. You're just finished. MEI offers a satiation experience. And if you add it to alcohol, it increases the attractiveness because it's a positive experience initially, but then you hit the satiation wall. So the window of attractiveness is really interesting because you don't want it unattractive. If you like antabuse, nobody will ever take antabuse twice. It's so horrible. But you don't want it too attractive because then it becomes an addiction problem in itself. So that window of attractiveness, of just attractive enough to want to do it, but not attractive enough to want to keep doing it. So that's what MEAI is. And so what it does is it offers the chance to break the binging cycle. If you really want to start out your experience drinking 26 ounces of vodka and you add MEI to it, you just simply stop. And what happens when you stop drinking or you greatly reduce your drinking is you become available for anything else. You can get counseling, for example. You could work on therapy. You can become engaged in your recovery process. We call it a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic because it's not disorienting in any way. You don't see things. It's not like 200 mics of LSD. It's not that like that at all. But we call it a psychedelic because it is a bit like MDMA at a low dose. So MEAI is what we're talking about, and it's a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I see that Gabor has now joined us, and we're going to introduce him in just a moment here. But before we bring him on officially, I just want to introduce you quickly to our CEO of Clearmind, Dr. Adi Zulakshani. She's going to say a few words and welcome everyone here. So if you don't know, Adi is a biomedical research and development executive with a vast experience of over 20 years of strategic and operational leadership in the healthcare industry and a deep understanding of therapeutics development in heavily regulated environments. So Dr. Zulakshani also holds a PhD in human biology and immunology from Bar Ilan University in Israel. So welcome, Dr. Adi Zulakshani. Oh, you're on mute there. We still.
Sorry. Yeah. So thank you everyone, and thank you Dr. Gabor and all the audience for joining us today. We are so very excited, not only to have as a speaker today the Honorable Dr. Gabor Maté, but also to see how many of you joining us today, which is extremely exciting for us. I do not want to spend Dr. Gabor's time, so I will be very quick in introducing the company. So we are Clearmind Medicine. We are a public company. The tickers will be posted into the chat. And we are developing a global approach solution for widespread problems, with the first one to be our proprietary MEI, which is a unique and innovative psychedelic compound for the treatment of alcoholism and other binge behaviors, such as eating. One of our most important goals, our mission, I should say, essentially, is to better the lives of millions who suffer from alcoholism and binge drinking. And although we have accomplished quite a lot of milestones since our inception, we are a young company, under a year old, But we are working towards our first human clinical study now, performing all the preclinical enabling studies in preparations toward FDA IND submission and a clinical trial for alcohol use disorder to be initiated by the end of this year. In parallel, we are also conducting some preclinical studies to show the safety and efficacy of MEAI. And one last detail that I think it's important to mention is that one of the things we are very proud of is that, and that differentiate us from other psychedelics companies, is that we already have a mature intellectual property portfolio with a worldwide patent protection, including the US, Europe, China, and India. And I'm really anxious, Dr. Gabor, to start the webinar, so I'll be silent from now and listening back the rest of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Adi. So now the man that you've all been waiting for, Dr. Gabor Maté. He's a retired physician who, after 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience, worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown east side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. This best-selling author of 4 books published in over 25 languages, including the award-winning In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, Gabor is an internationally renowned speaker, highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, trauma, and childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. For his groundbreaking medical work and writing, he has been awarded the Order of Canada, his country's highest civilian distinction, and the Civic Merit Award from his hometown, Vancouver. So to learn more, you can also join his e-news list at drgabormate.com. So welcome, Gabor. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Nice to join you and all these colleagues, Adi and Mark. Thank you for having me. I'll just plunge in.
All right. Well, we have a few questions for you.
You're going to bring in the questions, okay?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then once we have you answer a few of our questions, we're going to definitely open it up to the audience here as well.
But here's what I wonder. Can I just say a few words before you ask me questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. So you gave a pretty good definition of alcohol use disorder, which is one way to put it. It really fits in with my definition of addiction in general, which is addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary relief or pleasure in, and therefore craves, but suffers negative consequences and doesn't give it up despite, or can't give it up despite negative physical, psychological, spiritual, or relational consequences. So that's what an addiction is, any addiction. And alcohol obviously is one of the possible targets of that addictive behavior. But of course, the definition goes way beyond any particular substance. But alcohol is a major one. And alcohol has been around for thousands of years. And drunkenness has been around for thousands of years. But drunkenness is not the same as alcoholism. So alcoholism is a rather recent phenomenon in human history, which is interesting. In ancient Greek times, there used to be a cult of the god Dionysus, or in Latin, Bacchus, and people would get drunk, but they were not alcoholics. This is part of their religious practice, if you will. So people have always got drunk, but mass-scale alcoholism has not been around until fairly recently. That's the first point. The other interesting point is, if you look at even the word alcoholic spirit, spirituality. So alcohol has actually been used as a spiritual sacrament in some cultures. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The Greek historian Herodotus, in his histories, describes a tribe somewhere in the Near East, I forget where exactly, where the elders would get together if they had a big decision to make about war or peace or whatever big community issue was at hand. they would, if they were sober, they would make the decision, then they would get drunk. And if they confirmed the decision when drunk, then they would go with the decision. But if they were sober and they got drunk and they didn't confirm the decision, they would not go with the decision. Conversely, if they made a decision while they were under the influence of alcohol, then they would sober up and reconsider it. And if only they were in agreement with each other in both states, that's when they would go with the decision. That's a very interesting use of alcohol. And the Latins, the Romans used to have this saying, "In vino veritas," in wine there's truth, because somehow alcohol dissolves the falseness, and people say exactly what's on their minds, which sometimes is unfortunate, you know, but they're always revealing some truth about themselves. Now, as to why alcohol works on a biochemical level, basically it messes or plays with the biology of the brain. Particularly the neurotransmitter chemical messages in the brain. There are about 50 important brain chemicals, very complicated and complex interactions. But two of the major ones are glutamate, which is made from sugar, as the name implies, and GABA, G-A-B-A, which is gamma aminobutyric acid. And glutamate is an excitatory molecule, so that when glutamate appears in the space between the two nerve cells, it'll excite the next nerve cell, and GABA will inhibit the next nerve cells. And what alcohol does is it enhances the transmission of the inhibitory chemical GABA, and it diminishes the transmission of the excitatory chemical glutamate. And this has all kinds of psychological and physiological consequences. I'm not going to go more into the biology of it, but alcohol, like everything else, plays with the neurobiology of the brain. And so it enhances neurological inhibition. So therefore you become dizzy, or you can't walk, or you're not as coordinated, but it disinhibits you socially. So a lot of people who are shy and inhibited, when they drink alcohol, all of a sudden they become voluble and social and fun until they have the next drink, in which case when they become a real drag. So that's kind of the biology of it. Historically, alcoholism as a mass phenomena came along with capitalism. It came along with the deprivation of the commons lands in England, where the rising capitalist class took over the lands, and people had to leave their villages and their lands, lost their livelihood, had to go into the cities and work in these soulless factories where they were exploited and treated badly. And that's when the gene craze became in England a big phenomenon in the 18th century. So alcoholism as such, like any other addiction, is not simply a biological event, nor is it simply an individual personal event. It's also a social event. And we're seeing that right now. As the more alienation, the more stress there's in the society, the number of opioid deaths are going up. Now, the belief about alcoholism is that it's a genetic disease. Well, it's not genetic. In fact, in 1990, there was big newspaper reports about, we found the gene for alcoholism. They found nothing. Turned out that their gene had nothing to do with anything. And this has been the story for all the genes that they've discovered for any addiction. So whatever addiction is, it's not genetic. I won't go into the details of that. I'm just telling you that's how it is. And a writer on alcoholism, Lance Dodds, an American physician, says, the most important finding of research into the genetic role for alcoholism is that there's no such thing as a gene for alcoholism. That's just how it is. So then what is addiction then, and what is alcoholism specifically? There's a phrase in English that kind of tells you exactly what it's all about. There's a phrase in English for somebody who's drunk too much. Some of you may have heard it. We say, ah, he's feeling no pain. And that tells you he's feeling no pain. Alcohol, physiologically and psychologically, is all about numbing. As a matter of fact, before the days of modern anesthesia, if they had to operate on people, what would they do? They would get them drunk. They would give them alcohol to numb the pain. And so my mantra again about all addictions, including alcoholism, is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And I'm talking about the emotional pain. And so that it's not about, it's not about the molecule itself. It's not about the substance itself. I mean, I can ask you a question. Is alcohol addictive? You'd probably say yes. If I ask, is alcohol addictive, yes or no, you'd say yes. If I ask you, is heroin addictive, yes or no, you'd say yes. But that's not the right answer. Because I could ask you the same thing with food. Is food addictive, yes or no? Well, you might say yes, but if food in itself was addictive, then all of us would be food addicts, and we're not. If shopping is addictive, which it can be, everybody who's ever shopped would be a shopping addict. In other words, there's an interplay between the target behavior and the individual. Nothing is in itself addictive, including alcohol. A lot of us on this call can have 2 or 3 drinks and not crave anymore and not have to drink again next week. But some people on this call, if they have even one drink, they'd have difficulty refusing the next. So that has to do with who's susceptible for which addiction, and that has to do with trauma. And there's lots of research. I could cite you some of it. For example, let's see here. Yeah, those who suffer sexual abuse were 3 times more likely. This is a study of teenagers. Those who suffered sexual abuse were 3 times more likely to begin drinking in adolescence than those who had not. And if you're both sexually and emotionally abused, the risk goes even up, even higher. And so the adverse childhood experiences studies, the AC studies have shown this is true for all addictions, including alcohol. That's the one thing. The other thing is alcohol is not unique. It's really part of a process that one can call the general addiction, universal addiction process. And that process is the same for all addictions, whether it's to sex, gambling, pornography, alcohol, shopping, or heroin. It has to do with pain. It has to do with the need to escape pain. It has to do with the background of trauma. And very often these addictions, you give up one addiction, you go to another. So typically somebody will give up smoking, they'll start eating and put on a lot of weight. That's because until we deal with the underlying trauma, the addiction process is not satiated. So we just go from one to the other. And very typically, alcoholics will often have several addictions at the same time. There may be smokers, gamblers very often are both alcoholics and smokers, and so on and so forth. So in a nutshell, we're not talking about inherited disease. We're talking about a response to pain, emotional pain. That emotional pain is not simply an individual problem. It's a multi-generational family problem. And the reason I'm laughing is because I remember what a comedian said about, like, I'm Jewish and how come Jewish males aren't usually alcoholics? And maybe I shouldn't tell you this, but well, I won't tell you. You can ask me, but I won't tell you. Okay, right now. It begins with trauma. That trauma is in the family of origin. It's also in society in general. And in the 12-step movements, which I think the 12 steps of themselves are great, when they stand up and say, I'm so-and-so and I'm alcoholic, yeah, that's good that they should acknowledge their dysfunction and be willing to talk about it openly, but it's also not true. Nobody is an alcoholic. That's not who they are. The alcoholism was a response to life experience, and we shouldn't identify ourselves with our dysfunctions. So I understand the value of owning your dysfunction, but don't identify with it. And then the other thing is that 12-step movement, which is, I think Mark pointed out, it doesn't work for everybody. It works for about 20% of people, 15, 20%. That's pretty good compared to a lot of other treatments, but it's still not nearly enough. So I'm totally support the search for new solutions. And I don't know anything about the molecule that Mark was talking about, other than what he told me over a very pleasant lunch a few weeks ago. But if there was such a substance and it was proven to do what Mark says it can do, that'd be great, because we certainly need solutions, don't we? So psychedelics. So the molecule that Mark is talking about and that Clearmind is developing, I don't think they would say it's a psychedelic, really. Maybe you can address that later in the discussion. I've seen psychedelics in the sense that they really change the mind, they manifest the mind deeply. Now, I've seen psychedelics work for alcoholism as for other addictions. I've facilitated ayahuasca retreats where people have given up alcoholism permanently. Some people. Iboga is another plant psychedelic substance that can help people overcome alcoholism or other addictions. In each of these cases, those plant substances actually create a mental environment that in the right setting can help you work out your trauma and get past it. Now, what is being proposed here is a substance that will not do that on its own, but it'll interrupt your use of alcohol so that you can go to work on it. And I think this is where the 12 steps sometimes fall short, because they help people stop, but because they don't recognize trauma for what it is, they don't help a lot of people work out their traumas. So I'll stop there. It's about pain relief, it's about trauma, and anything that we can develop that'll stop people needing to rely on it so they can really work on their trauma would be a really good thing.
Well, thank you, Gabor. You've pretty much answered all of the questions that I had lined up for you. So, definitely some important information there. When we're looking at addiction and trauma, and alcohol, so you gave us a great history of alcohol there. Alcohol is it's a social thing. It's a social beverage, and to go out and have a drink is something that's fun to do. But when does it really become a problem, and when does someone, where's that line? Especially like if we look at the pandemic, people are, oh, I'll just have a bottle of wine, it'll help me. And when does 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 bottles of wine become a problem? And why does that happen?
Well, it happens because, it becomes a problem when it becomes a problem. In other words, when it starts creating negative consequences in your life, when you become socially inappropriate, where you get into a car accident, where the rage that you've been suppressing all your life surfaces and you start being violent or rageful towards your family, when you sleep in so you can't go to work. So, I mean, it becomes a problem when it becomes a problem. And that point is different for every person. What was the second part of your question, Shannon?
Where's the line? When we look at addiction and we look at trauma, is there a difference? How are they related? One really is an effect of the other.
Okay.
Not?
Well, so first of all, we need to get rid of a kind of myth. People think I'm not an alcoholic because I'm not a drunkard falling down in a ditch. Well, you don't have to be. That's not the question. The question is it causing harm in your life? Personally, psychologically, emotionally, relationally, professionally, spiritually. If it is, you got a problem. I don't care what you call yourself, but you got a problem. Now, in terms of the relationship between addiction and trauma, not every traumatized person becomes an addict, but every addict was traumatized. Mm-hmm. So trauma, I could talk about this forever, but it has many potential consequences. What we call mental illness, in my view, is always rooted in trauma. By the way, just as there's been no genes for alcoholism, there's also been no genes for mental illness either, you know. And we have some very false ideas out there about mental illness, which is not the subject of this seminar. But trauma can lead to mental and physical illness. For example, the more adversity you experience in childhood, the greater your risk of heart disease in adult, regardless of lifestyle, regardless of whether you smoke or not. The greater the risk of autoimmune disease, the greater risk of cancer, the greater risk of ADHD, the greater the risk of depression, anxiety, um, and so on, and of addiction in general. So addiction is one of the outcomes of trauma. So that's why I say not every person traumatized becomes an addict, but every addicted person was traumatized. And there's only 10,000 scientific papers to say so. And what's interesting, of course, and I don't know, maybe Dr. Adi could comment on this, but I don't know what the situation in Israel is. I know where my book, by the way, on addiction was just published a few months ago, but the medical profession just doesn't understand the link between trauma and addiction and mental health conditions. We see these as kind of separate entities, and we don't link it to trauma, despite all the evidence. Despite all the evidence.
Thank you. So you did mention the medical profession. What challenges are there with current treatments for alcohol use disorder, addiction, and those suffering from traumas?
Well, the average medical student is lucky if they get one lecture on addiction. Never mind alcohol specifically, addiction in general. They're fortunate if they get one lecture on it. Number one. Number two, if they do get a lecture, it'll be on the brain disease model. The average medical student does not hear a single lecture on trauma. Now, I have a new book coming out this year, but in my previous books and this new one, all the scientific literature linking trauma and illness, so that whether it's multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis or alcoholism, there's always a significant traumatic component. The average student should not hear one lecture. They should have a whole course. They should have a 4-year course on the implications of trauma. They don't even hear the word almost. That's maybe changing a little bit, but certainly as largely as the fact. Because the Western medicine separates the mind from the body. And so we study everything biologically. And that's why, from the Western medical point of view, from within the Western medical ideology, there's no way to explain the success of psychedelics in treating all these conditions. But if you understand the mind-body unity, there's no mystery whatsoever. So there's medical training. Then there is the pharmaceutical companies who fund most of the research. And they're far more interested in medications that suppress symptoms than provide healing. I mean, the poor dears, they're out there make money, so you can't blame them, but that's what they do. And so a lot of the literature that doctors read is funded by companies who have no interest in healing. They have interest in symptom control. And I could talk about social reasons as well, but let's just recognize that the average physician is very poorly situated to help somebody with any addiction problem.
Which is unfortunate. And you did mention training programs there, and you do have your training program. I think it's in the 10th year or 10th round, Gabor, and you have not only helped people personally through your work, your books, being a physician, but you're now helping people help people by training them on how to deal with trauma. So this might be, taking it back to the beginning, but did you just wake up one day and say, I just want to train people on how to deal with trauma, and I want to be an internationally renowned author? What's your story? How did this come about?
What I've always said about me is that I've always been famous. It's just that nobody ever heard about me, So I didn't wake up one morning. And it's just a gradual evolution. I had my own addictive issues. I had my own stuff. I've had my own mental health issues. So in dealing with them, I learned a lot about human beings, and I'm still dealing with them. And in in uh, in medical practice, if your eyes are open, you can't help noticing what's in front of you. That the people with physical illness, chronic illness, and certainly mental illness, and certainly addictions, are always, there's some significant emotional pain issues rooted in childhood trauma. In terms of the training, no, I just started counseling people and working with people in groups and leading psychedelic retreats. I'm not going to go into the whole history. And then people kept asking me, will you teach us what you do? And I said, I can't teach you anything because I don't know what I do. I just do it. And so in a nutshell, people said, yeah, you can teach this. And it turned out they took what my own teachings and they made it into a course and into a, which is now, it's called Compassionate Inquiry. It's now being studied by 2,500 people in over 80 countries in the last 3 years. And it's in Romania and Hungary and Israel and UK and North America and it's all over the world really. But I didn't create it. I generated it without knowing how, and then people took it and they made a course out of it. I can't take credit for it.
Well, it's definitely helped a lot of people, and I know I've taken one of your compassionate inquiries as well, and definitely had some profound healing from that. So when you talk about trauma, I want to get back to alcohol use disorder in a moment.
Sure.
But what exactly is trauma, if you were to explain it in a few sentences?
Sure. So trauma, it's very simple. It comes from a Greek word for wounding, for wound. So trauma is a psychological wound. So if you take the metaphor of a wound, what's the nature of a wound? Well, if I have an open wound, if I touch it, it really hurts. So a trauma, by the way, trauma is not what happens to you. So not the way I talk about it. Trauma is not the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, um, the genocide. Those are traumatic, but that's not the trauma. And by the way, speaking of which, let me show you something. I'll be right back. So this is a photograph of me and my mother when I was 3 months of age. If you can see it clearly enough, that's not the face of a 3-month-old. That kid has a very haunted look on his face. And my mother's wearing a yellow star right there. That's the yellow star shining. That's what Jews had to wear during the war under the Nazi occupation. So I spent my first year under the Nazi occupation and barely survived. But that was very traumatic. But that's not what the trauma is. The trauma is the wound that happens inside me as a result. So trauma is the sensitive wound that when you touch it, it really hurts. So even 70 years later, or 50 years later, or 10 years later, when something reminds you of that original wound, you feel pain. And that's when we're triggered, by the way. So trauma is the wound. Now, the other nature of the wound, other than that, is very sensitive to look at from the other point of view. A wound develops scar tissue. Now, scar tissue, what's the quality of scar tissue? It's thick, it's hard, it doesn't grow, it's rigid, and there's no feeling in it. So on the one hand, there's a hypersensitivity, but on the other hand, there's also a shutdown of genuine feelings, genuine emotions, because it was too painful to feel them. So the rage and fear that I would have had as an infant, if there's nobody there to hold it, the child is in an unbearable situation and they push down these feelings. So trauma then is a wound that you sustain with long-term consequences. Trauma disconnects you from your body because it's too painful to stay connected. Trauma disconnects you from other people. It gives you a distorted view of the world. It takes you away from the present moment. So trauma, and it gives you a world, and it gives you and then you develop adaptive mechanisms that you identify with. So, for example, you push down your emotions. Well, then I'm this stoical person. I don't have emotions. By the way, what do we call it when we push something down? What's the other word for pushing something down? It's depressing something.
Mhm.
So 40 years later, you're diagnosed with depression, this disease of depression. No, it wasn't a disease. You were pushing down your emotions because they were too painful to experience. So trauma is the wound that you sustain and the consequences of that wound. But that's the good news, because if the trauma was what happened to me 77 or 78 years ago now, there's nothing I can do about it. There's nothing I can do about the fact that I was this infant. There's nothing I can do about the fact that my grandparents were killed in Auschwitz. But if the trauma is the wound that I sustained, the sense of abandoned self and the pain and the rage, if it's the wound, I can do something about that in the present moment. So that's why I say that trauma is not what happened to you. It's what happened inside you as a result of what happened to you. And that's the good news, because we can do something about it.
And the key is doing the right thing about it, right? So on one hand, we can soothe with certain things like alcohol and, other drugs or shopping or food. What would be, so what would be the a good way to deal with this?
Well, one way to the Greek playwright Aeschylus, in his play The Agamemnon, he says that the gods created us in such a way that we have to suffer into truth. So that's just how it is. Most of us don't wake up very easily, um, unless suffering forces into it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to recognize that we suffer.
Yeah.
And we have to have some sense that it doesn't have to be this way. So that's the first step. And it is to disidentify from the suffering enough. Okay, so yeah, I feel like drinking because life feels so miserable. But maybe I can deal with the reason why my life feels so miserable instead of escaping into the behavior. It's got to start with that recognition on some level. And most of us, we have to suffer quite a bit before we get to that point. But that's a very big first step. The second step is asking, finding the right kind of help, which is not always easy, but it's always available.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Canada, we have a really tragic example of our First Nations people, um, who had no addiction issues prior to colonization. None. Even though in some areas of North America, they knew alcohol, but they were not alcoholics. They used it for spiritual purposes, actually. Um, and now in Canada, in the downtown east side where I worked with addictions of all kinds, 30% of the people are First Nations origin, even though they only make up 4 or 5% of the Canadian population. And that's the same in every country with its colonization. And 30% of the people in jail in this country are First Nations people, even though only make up 5% of the population. Why? Because of the trauma that was imposed on them by colonialism. The near genocidal behavior, certainly the attempt to wipe out their culture, the abduction of their children, the destruction of the family, the denigration of women. It used to be matrilineal, the culture, and the colonialists got rid of that very quickly. So this is where we have to recognize that we're dealing with not within just individual factors, we're talking about broad social factors.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we could probably spend, many, many hours and webinars definitely talking about that. There's so many affected there. I'm wondering, so if someone is in, they're soothing with alcohol, they've come to figure that this is the only hope is, by drinking day after day, and it becomes an addiction. Um, if you could take someone, out of that space for a moment, and produce some kind of immediate satiation effect, how would this affect their treatment? So, for example, if someone is an alcoholic using alcohol, their next thing is just to take that next drink. What if there was something that could stop that? How would that affect the treatment?
Well, I think Mark said it very eloquently or clearly enough that they would give them some pause where they could actually address the real issues. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it wouldn't on its own heal the trauma and wouldn't on its own um, stop the addictive drive, which might express itself in other ways, by the way. They might start shopping or something, but they'd be clear-headed enough to address the underlying issues. So it'd be a stepping stone, but obviously a very helpful and some people essential stepping stone towards undertaking the long-term task of healing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think Adi and Mark could probably speak more to this, but I really think that's the mission of, Clearmind and MEAI is to clear that path, to leave that space for people to, go to people and then work with their therapists and people like you to get to that trauma. And just, having something there to like not take that next drink, right? Whether, maybe you've been sober for 20 years and you have the urge, just even having that something there. And then the reminder to work on trauma. And speaking of, trauma that we're all in right now, given the situation we're currently in globally with the pandemic, this is creating a lot of trauma for all ages.
Yes.
If you could leave the viewers today, I think we had over 2,300 registered. We have over close to 1,200 people here today watching. If you could leave these people with, a few words of suggestions or a little bit of advice on how, where do they start? What could you do? Um, to.
But, that's the kind of question I hope you wouldn't ask me because I don't have very, very smart answers on this one. What is a fact is that alcoholism has gone up during the pandemic, as has drug use in general. Domestic violence has gone up. More women are drinking now. And in fact, the number of women drinking is going up and up and up. Used to be mostly a male, not exclusively, but the number of women growing up drinking has been going up for years now, and has increased during the pandemic. Um, it's hard to give general advice when people are in such different situations. But I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, is that this capitalist idea that we're aggressive, individualistic, hostile, competitive individuals as a nature has been blasted to hell. We're social creatures. We need to connect. Our brains are wired to connect. Our physiology depends on connection. So if there's only general advice I can give is, whatever connection you can seek and find in your life, do it. Don't try it. Don't try and live your life on your own. Don't try to do it all by yourself. We all need help. We all need support. We all need connection. And unfortunately, modern society is much better at splitting and dividing and alienating than in bringing together. But maybe we need a different vision of what society might look like. Well, that's a very up in the sky statement, but I'll have to leave you with that one. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I leave this question with that one. That is.
For sure. Well, thank you. I'm just looking at our question box here, and it looks like we have 90 questions in there for you, Gabor. But before we get to that, Mark or Adi, did you have any questions that you wanted to pose for Gabor?
I really appreciate everything Gabor said. Thank you. Just appreciations.
Thank you, Mark.
And
Nothing from you, Adi? No, no questions there?
No, no, no. Just
No?
like Mark said, great appreciation for this amazing lecture.
Thank you.
So if you have time, Gabor, we'll take a couple of questions from the chat, but I just wanted to ask one other thing here. You have your new book that is coming out. So this will be your fifth book, I believe, and it's on pre-sale right now, available September 15th. Are we,
Please, please, 13th. Don't delay it anymore. Okay?
September 13th. Are you allowed to give us like a sneak peek about about the book, or some?
I just did really. The title is The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And that kind of says it, so that what is normal in this society is, oh yeah, there's the book. Yeah. What is normal in this society is actually not healthy or natural. We have this myth of what normality looks like. What we're living through right now and have been for decades is not normal, not when it comes to the actual needs of human beings. And I'm saying that this culture, the way it's organized, it traumatizes a lot of people. And by the way, when it comes to trauma, it doesn't have to be terrible things happening to you. You don't need war and genocide, racial oppression. I mean, those are traumatic, but you don't need them, because you can hurt people not only by doing bad things to them, but by not meeting their needs. So for example, I could hurt you by hitting you. I could also hurt you by depriving you of water. It's the same with emotional needs. I could emotionally abuse you, or I could just deprive you of your emotional needs. And in modern culture, uh, children's emotional needs are severely not undermet, in fact, denied. And so a lot of people are hurt by loving parents in the context of a culture that doesn't know anything about what genuine human needs are. So that's why I say it's a toxic culture. So that's the preview, and it'll be available, and it'll be published in September.
Perfect. Thank you. So do you have time for a couple of questions here from the chat?
Sure, couple.
These ones kind of go together, and it has to do with generational trauma. And it says, does generational trauma have an effect on the DNA of the next generation? The other one is pretty much the same. If alcoholism is not genetic, is trauma. So can it be passed down through your DNA?
Not through the DNA as such, but how the DNA is activated or not activated. So that's called epigenetics. Epigenetics is the epi means on top of. So epigenetics is the effect of the environment on genes. And so that trauma can affect not the DNA structure, but how genes operate. And that can be passed on a generation. So epigenetics does travel across generations. It's a new field, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on it, because trauma is passed on more specifically. Like, I had my own trauma, which I talked about the sources of it. Well, I passed on my trauma to my children, not necessarily through the DNA structure, but just because of the way I behaved, and the way I hadn't dealt with my emotions. And when you marry somebody, by the way, good or bad news for you all, but you always marry somebody exactly at the same level of trauma as you were at. So that if I marry somebody, that person will and did carry the same level of trauma as I did, not in the same way. But that means not two traumatized people are raising children. And most of us have children before we work out our trauma. Most of us have children before we even recognize that we have trauma. So we just pass it on, not genetically, we just do. So yes, there's an epigenetic effect, but even without that, there's plenty of ways that we pass on our trauma.
Thank you. Just one more question before we let you go here. And we touched briefly on psychedelics. And the question is, what is the relationship between the realm of hungry ghosts and psychedelics?
So the title of my addiction book is In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. And the title itself comes from a Buddhist concept. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there are 6 realms through which human beings cycle. There's the ordinary human realm, which is our ordinary self, just the way we are. There's the animal realm, which is our drives and our passions and our hungers and so on. There's the God realm. There's a couple of other. There's hell realm, the hell realm, which is the realm of terrible pain and rage and terror. There's the hungry ghost realm, and the hungry ghosts are depicted as creatures with small mouths, narrow necks, and big empty bellies. So they're always striving to fill their large empty bellies through these small mouths and narrow gullets, and they can't do it. And my contention is that people get into the hungry ghost realm. And by the way, it's not that you live in one or the other. We all move through all 6 of them. In fact, we might even do in the same day. Some moments you're in the hell realm, and then you're in the animal realm, full of lust and passion. Then you might be in the human realm. You might be in the spiritual God realm, or you might be in the hungry ghost realm, might be in the hell realm. But the point is that, in my view, people drift into the hungry ghost realm, trying to satiate that emptiness from the outside to escape the hell realm, which is based on trauma. So if you're Tibetan Buddhist, these are real realms. For me, they're metaphoric of the human experience.
And how do psychedelics
Your psychedelics, yeah. So psychedelics in the right environment, in the right context, and I have to emphasize that. And Mark, who's very knowledgeable about psychedelics, will agree with me. In the right context and under the right guidance, can open up all these realms to your consciousness. So you can actually be in the hell realm. But that's not a bad thing, because now you can see what's inside you. You can also get into the hungry ghost realm and see how you've been escaping the hell realm through all these addictions. And you can also experience, you might say, the God realm of love and connection and wholeness, where you realize there's nothing to run away from. And you can go through all these experiences with the help of psychedelics in the right context with the right guidance.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And a comment more so, but it is a question that came up, but someone's asking, how do psychedelics rewire the brain to help heal trauma and addiction? So it would be by allowing someone to go in and really see what's in those realms and work with it.
Yes. And there also might be a certain degree of physiological rewiring for a while anyway, not permanently, but yeah, both of those things happen. But to me, the psycho-emotional reset is much more important than the biological rewiring,
Mm-hmm.
in my understanding. And I don't think we fully know yet exactly.
Well, we have over 100, almost 100 questions left here for you, Gabor. You're definitely a very popular person, and it's been an honor having you here today. I was wondering, and I just want to be conscious of your time, so I was wondering if you have any final words to say today.
No, I don't, and because I kind of summarized it all. I mean, I could speak for another 10 days, of course. Um, but I tell you what I'm going to do. In half an hour, I have my appointment at the swimming pool, and if I don't go swimming, I get into the hell realm. So that's what I'm going to do. So thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. I wish I could answer more questions, but maybe some other time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. We'd love to have you back. Maybe closer to the launch of your book on September 13th. Uh,
Good thing.
coming out then. So definitely a huge, Huge thank you. And like you said, we could definitely talk longer. We really just touched on a few of these things. We could go so much deeper into all of the things here. And I know we have quite a few questions on, MEAI and all of that as well. So we'll definitely have some more webinars coming up for those interested in finding out more. So thank you again, Gabor. It's definitely a pleasure
Thank you.
having you here today.
Okay.
And
Bye.
we appreciate it so much. So to close off the webinar, are there any final words here from Adi or Mark that you would like to say before I go into the closing here?
I think we've just opened up a discussion that we need to keep having. This is the beginning of a long chat. Thank you.
Yeah. I agree, and really, I think it was amazing webinar. I enjoyed very much the talk. I hope the audience also. And I saw some of the questions running and asking about those some of the comments that Dr. Gabor had about treatment and psychedelics and alcoholism. So it might be a very good idea that we have a follow-up webinar just discussing some of the questions that might be more relevant to our treatment and what we see as our solution and how it combined with some of the stuff that Dr. Gabor mentioned during the talk.
Absolutely. There were definitely some questions here on MEAI and the mechanism of action and, where it is in clinical trials. So I don't know if you want to briefly touch on that, Adi, before we close it off here.
So as I said at the beginning, we are in preparation towards the first in man study, which will be initiated towards the end of the year. But on another webinar, I really want to touch because this is something that keeps coming, whether a treatment for alcoholism is something that companies should pursue and develop, whether it's sufficient. And I don't see it as, it's not one or the other, just what kind of, I see it as a crunches, what kind of aid we can provide a patient in order to go into and check why he's traumatized, what is the basis for the trauma, but he still needs a tool to be able to go out there and look for it, because if he needs to struggle all the time with his craving for drinking, then the entire it's much more complex. But if we give these crunches, we give him something that can help him stop drinking on one end and then start looking or continue looking into the trauma, continue looking into the mental health issue or a cure, I think that's a winning combination, and this is exactly where we are aiming our product to be. But I think I think we need to take it into consideration, have a specific webinar about it, and really discuss it into more thorough.
Absolutely. And we will be sending out a newsletter, which I'll mention in a bit, with webinars that we have coming up in the future. Just a quick question for you, Mark, here. What does MEAI stand for, chemical structure, and how was it developed?
MEAI stands for 5-methoxy-2-aminoindane, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's a part of the aminoindane group, which feel a little bit like MDMA. That's why we call it a psychedelic, but it's non-hallucinogenic because it's not like LSD, a high dose. It doesn't disorient you. It's not a spiritual experience. It's just a warm, fuzzy, positive experience that isn't too dramatic. It doesn't really pull you to do it again and again and again, but it does interrupt drinking and perhaps other addictions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark. Well, we are a little bit over time here, so I will just finish up by saying thank you again for everyone who joined us today for this webinar. Again, thank you to Dr. Gabor Maté for his brilliance and efforts to bettering this world through his work. It's definitely a pleasure having him on. And also thank you to the wonderful organizations that showed their support for the webinars. We have Investors Brand Network, Psychedelic Newswire, Valen Hypnotherapy, The Flying Sage, Insight Global, CFN Media, Microdose, Take Back Your Power, and Force Field EMF. And thanks again to everyone who's working behind the scenes to make these webinars possible. Just a few things here before we go. If you'd like to find out more about Clearmind and MEAI, you can join one of the future webinars, but also you can visit the website at clearmindmedicine.com. We'll just pop it in the chat here. Also, you can follow us on all of the platforms. We'll also pop the social media handles in the chat here as well. If you are interested in investing in Clearmind, which is a public company, you can find Clearmind at Clearmind Medicine Inc. We're going to pop this in the chat. It's on the Canadian Securities Exchange, Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and the OTC. And then we also have a contact for investor relations, which is in there as well. So our next event will be on February 23rd. So in 20 days, we are going to pop a registration link in the chat there as well. So if you'd like to go ahead, you can sign up for that. We'll be talking more about investing, as well as, of course, MEAI and Clearmind. We'll also be sending out a newsletter, most likely within the next day or so, with all of this information on it. So be sure to check your email. It will come from Clearmind Community Relations. And as mentioned, there will be a quick survey at the end of the seminar. We would love for you to fill it out and let us know how we did today. We will be drawing one winner who will receive Gabor's book, so we'll contact you via email. And we've also selected a winner from our previous webinar, so you'll be contacted by email as well. Please reply so we can get your prize out to you. So thanks again for joining us today. That is it for our broadcast, and we hope to see you again on one of the future webinars. So thank you again. Bye for now.
Thank you.